All right, guys, welcome back to Podcasting on a Plane, episode number 15 about the Millionaires Unit. And as promised, this is a really, really cool interview. Now, I like a good documentary as much as anybody, but you know what? Sometimes I just have to be in the right mood, and especially if it's one of those like World War I History Channel type things. So when I found out about this one, I said, okay, cool, I'll go screen it when I get a chance. But when I finally sat down with it, I was immediately hooked. And that's because this documentary does something that's difficult for some documentaries to do, which is to get you to bond with the characters in it. But I was really drawn to one of the main characters, and we're going to talk about that during the interview. So whether or not you're a war buff or a history buff or just not into that stuff at all, I think you're still going to really like the film. And more importantly, hearing my guests Darroch, Greer, and Ron King, who made the film, talk about what it was like making the film over a 7-year period is something that you're not going to want to miss. But before we get to that interview, I have a couple of thank yous. And first off, thank you to all the new followers we have on Instagram. I'm really glad you're enjoying my highly limited photography skills, but I'm trying to post pictures for you guys almost every day. So follow the show on Instagram at Podcasting on a Plane so you don't miss any of that. And while you're there, you might see a cool picture of my recording setup, or at least my mobile one. And I have a couple different setups that I use to record this show, and hopefully it's hard for you to tell which one I'm using, or at least that's the case if I've done my job. But if you want to hear more about it, you can actually go check out my man Chris Curran's podcast called The Podcast Engineering Show. Chris is an audio engineer, and he has album credits to his name, and he's a really funny guy. He does actually a couple of podcasts of his own, like Social Media Unscrambled. And I was honored to be the guest on his last week's episode, number 84. And we had all kinds of nerdy and pedantic about recording using mobile setups and how I produce this podcast for you guys. So if you're at all interested in audio production, go check out the Podcast Engineering Show with Chris Curran. And you know what? Even if you're not an audio geek, his show is still really, really fun. He has clips from the guy who used to be the janitor at his old building that has his golden voice and says all kinds of funny stuff. He mixes that in, and that's part of it while he teaches you how to engineer sound. So it's really entertaining whether you like, mixing or not. But back to this show. This is a longer episode, so we're going to get right into the fun stuff. But before we do that, I want to make a public thank you, and that's to a man named Darren. Yes, this really is his name, Wang Chung. He made a generous contribution to the show, and Darren, you're the man. And you're all probably going to hear from him in a later episode where, when the time is right, he's going to be sharing his role in a new life-saving technology. But until then, let's all congratulate him on his new flying job at a top-notch regional carrier. Well done, Darren. And also, I've added a new feature to the website where you can record a message for me with no equipment required. Now, remember a couple episodes back, I talked about how you can record an episode using like a mobile device and you could download an app or whatever. You know what? Let's just make it even easier than that. Go to podcastingonaplane.com/contact and there's a recorder right there for you. So you're just 2 clicks away from being on the show. And lastly, and I promise this is the last thing, somebody gave me a really great VHF shout out a couple weeks ago at the tower, but I wasn't there. And my coworkers told me, but unfortunately it was a couple days later. So whoever that was, can you shoot me an email so I can go back and find it? And for anyone who wants to say hi as they fly by, if you do a VHF shout out and I'm not around, make sure to message me somehow, like through podcastingonaplane.com/contact, and then I can go pull up the recording so I can share it with everybody. All right, enough about that. Now it's time to take a flight 100 years back in time, and we're going to learn about a group of privileged men that changed the course of World War I. And I know what you're thinking. Why would I want to go spend 2 hours of my life watching a movie about how a bunch of rich white boy Yaleys learned about flying machines? But it's cool. Don't worry. It turns out they used their family's fortunes actually to leverage the skills that they needed to contribute to victory in World War I. How? Well, let's sit down with Darroch and Ron and find out. Darroch and Ron, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having us, Brandon.
Thank you.
Okay, so when I first heard about this film, I thought, okay, World War I documentary, let's check this out. And when I turned it on, it was so much more than just a documentary. It was a story unfolding about what these men did 100 years ago. They started from a privileged background, but no military background, no military history. And then by the end of the documentary, these men had changed the course of history. So this unit was started at Yale, and these guys went from nothing into being a full-fledged Naval Aviation Unit that was pretty much kicking ass and taking names in World War I. So, Darroch and Ron, can you just give us an overview about what the film is about?
If you don't mind, Ron, I want to jump in and just say what the First Yale Unit was. And this was a group of guys, almost all of them very wealthy at Yale, were fraternity brothers, later got into some of the secret societies. But the real frontier in America at the time, this is 11 years after the Wright brothers flew, was aviation. And these guys wanted to learn to fly. They were thinking of going down to Mexico to help with the border war with Pershing down there, and then turn their sights to World War One. And so they started an Aero group, and they got official endorsement from Yale. But the original idea was from Admiral Robert Byrd and the Aero Club of America that the war might come across the Atlantic to the United States, and they wanted squadrons set up 100 miles apart up and down the eastern seaboard to do patrols and look for submarines out over the ocean. And so these guys who volunteered and got their wealthy daddies to buy them a plane and learn to fly were the very first squadron of this aerial coast patrol, which never really got off the ground, but actually they did fly, and they did do it a little bit. They kept trying to get the Navy to recognize them. The Navy didn't really have any reason to, didn't really understand the need for aviation until all of a sudden we went to war. And the Navy turned to these guys because they were virtually the only guys that had already started to learn to fly and were organized as a squadron. And then one of the interesting things was they thought they were going to go overseas and fly together as a unit. But since they had the experience that they had, they were all split up between flying experimental aircraft, going to aviation schools, some becoming fighter pilots, some taking desk jobs, but pretty much all split up. And of the 38 members, I think there were altogether, all but 4 eventually made it overseas for the war.
Okay. Now, what motivated you guys to actually make this film in the first place?
Well, I can address that a little bit. I was in a position where I was interested in making a feature-length film of some kind. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to make a film about, but I was ready to invest the effort to attempt to make a feature-length film. And it just so happened that I was in a bookstore and randomly browsing books, and I spotted a stack of new arrivals in the corner, and I walked over to it and saw a photograph on the cover of one of the books. And lo and behold, there was a photograph of my grandfather that I had never seen before. But I saw the title of the book, which was The Millionaires Unit, and I immediately knew what the book was about because I had recalled that my grandfather was indeed a naval aviator in World War I, though I really didn't know any of the details of his experience. And this book had come out unbeknownst to me or my family. And that's sort of what kicked off the whole process. I got a hold of the book. I was invited to go sit on a panel in New York City that was put on by the author, Mark Wortman. In the meantime, I contacted Darroch, my old friend from college, who was a working filmmaker and documentarian, and I presented him with the book and said, Darroch, what do you think? And should we try to make a documentary about this? And that came about after I had asked Mark Wortman, the author, if there was indeed a documentary already underway, because I really wanted to see it. And Mark said, no, there's not to my knowledge, there's no documentary being made right now. And that sort of put the idea in my head that maybe I could try to make one, but I would need a heck of a lot of help. And Darroch was the perfect partner to make it come about.
So you guys were kind of like some of the men in this film where you were college buddies and so on back in the day, right?
Well, I never quite thought about it that way, but yeah.
No secret societies, though?
No, I'm afraid not.
I was going to say the only secret society that Darroch and I were involved with in college was the fact that we were both aspiring actors. And, whatever secret society evolves around being an aspiring actor is the one that we were in.
Ron and I played Brutus and Cassius in a scene from Julius Caesar together in college.
That is true.
Okay, so not quite war, but definitely a bonding experience, right?
Yeah. Ron presented this book, and also there was another book that the Davison family, Truby Davison was the young man at Yale whose idea this was, and his father was J.P. Morgan's business partner, and that's partially how they got off the ground. But after the war, in I think 1925, the family privately published a 2-volume history of the Yale unit and gave copies free to every library in the United States. And the 2 volumes had a lot of letters from the First Yale Unit members. And so we realized it was a very character-driven, personal narrative, and that's really how we wanted to tell the story. We started getting in touch. Ron met a bunch of, maybe half dozen families up at that talk in New York at the Yale Club, and we realized that there were these private collections of photographs, and I thought we could make kind of a neat little family film, and maybe we could get a little bit of money and put this together. But we very quickly realized that planes were involved, and we needed to do something about that. And luckily, we discovered there was a collection in Central California, really the most pristine collection in the world of several dozen planes, all with original engines. And we got ourselves invited to a fly-in. And early in the morning, annually, when they have this fly-in, they fly part of the collection. And we heard a Sopwith Camel and saw these planes up close and heard the engines and realized what incredible things they were that really had not been captured, as far as we could tell, in a film before. And that really excited the both of us, that we want to tell a character-driven story through the eyes of these guys, but we really want the audience to understand what it took to fly planes like that 100 years ago.
Sure. No, when the first time you hear an actual vintage engine and see the rickety airplanes that the guys flew and how they were powered and how they were flown and how frankly dangerous they were just by themselves, forget about the war part, it sort of changes the way you think about aviation. It's so simple now and so safe and so refined. But back then, the life expectancy was so short. And I'm sure we'll get to this later on, but one thing that you guys spoke about in the film was how short the life expectancy was for these guys that were in training. I mean, forget about getting to the actual fighting part and being shot at, but just making it through training alive was difficult in and of itself, right?
Yeah, it really was. And several of the pilots were aligned with British squadrons with the RAF, and the British training in the first 2 years of the war was really pathetic, and they lost a lot of pilots. I think there were 14,000 aviation deaths in World War I, and 8,000 of those occurred in training. And it wasn't until the third year of the war that a guy named Smith Berry came in and really changed the way they trained pilots and made it safer and much more effective. The French were much better with it at the time, but these American guys from the First Yale Unit were not flying with the French. They were training with the French, and so that was helpful. But by the time they got to the war, things were a bit safer. But life expectancy for British pilots for a good portion of the war was about 3 weeks, and yet these guys still went in to fly. It's kind of amazing.
I can't even imagine being up against odds like that and still signing up.
I'd like to mention, I'm sorry, one more thing, that our DVD and Blu-ray that have just come out, we have 4 supplementary films. And one of them, it's only 15 minutes long, but it's on flying the Sopwith Camel with Javier Arango and Gene DeMarco. And they've been flying it for a long time, and they talk very specifically about it. But Gene says, and I think Tommy Sopwith Jr., whom we also interviewed over in London, says that there were more deaths in learning to fly the Sopwith Camel than in actual combat. And Gene says, so there's the argument of, who is it better for, the British or the Germans?
One thing I'd like to add on to the training aspect is that when the Yale unit first learned to fly back in 1916, they were working with a trainer or teacher by the name of David McCullough. And he was very insistent that the Yale unit members learn how to not only fly the airplane, but to break it down and to take it apart and to put it all back together again. So, and this was the flying boat, the Marianne, which was the Curtiss Model F flying boat that they learned to fly in. And so, my point there is that not only were they learning the rudiments of how to fly, but they also were learning the aircraft inside and out. I remember my uncle told me a funny story about my grandfather that at one point, and I believe this was when they were on the war front over in Europe. He actually, like, my grandfather had to like climb out onto a wing and fix something on the airplane as they were flying to make it so that the aircraft was working. I'm not sure exactly what the problem was, but the notion of fixing things while you're flying to keep the aircraft going was something that they were prepared to do because of their training.
Yeah, yeah. Incidentally, I just wanted to say that their instructor, Dave McCullough, was one of the NC pilots that after the war made the first transatlantic flight to the Azores to Portugal, I guess. His plane didn't make it. There were four of them that went out, and the NC-4 made it. But Dave McCullough was one of those four teams of guys on these big flying boats that went across the Atlantic. These were all Glenn Curtiss aircraft, and so they were, they were water aircraft that the Navy. They didn't. They did early experiments in 1910, 1911 of flying on and off a plane, but they didn't want to flying on and off a ship. But they didn't want to devote the entire ship to just these flimsy aircraft. So Glenn Curtiss came up with the idea of taking off from and landing on the water, and then hoisting the plane on shipboard and then off. And so that's what they were training to do in the Navy.
Amazing. Now, Ron, I want to take a couple minutes to talk to you about, since you're a direct descendant of one of these guys, what was it like growing up and hearing the stories about what, it was your grandfather, right? What he had done?
Right. I mean, that was the whole revelation of Mark Wortman's book being published, because my grandfather passed away when I was about 10 years old. And, I didn't have any clue about World War I or aviation at that point in my life, even though I liked drawing pictures of airplanes. And I was never able to ask him direct questions about his experience in World War I. What ended up happening was that my aunt kept a collection of about 200 letters that my grandfather had written during that period. And I took about 2 years in transcribing all of those letters. So I went from knowing virtually nothing about my grandfather's World War I experience, other than the fact that he was a pilot. I knew that much. But it wasn't until I got into those letters that I really learned the details of everything that had happened back in 1916 through 1918, 19. And that particular group of letters was one that author Mark Wortman did not have access to when he was writing his book. So you talk about the research for the film and what we learned about the relatives' war experience. Well, they were big letter writers back in those days. They recorded everything in their letters. And so it wasn't only my grandfather's collection of letters that really helped us with the movie, but Darroch, I think, must have read hundreds and hundreds of other letters written by the other Yale Unit members that were sent back to Truby Davison after his injury. So yes, we got lots and lots of war stories, but they didn't come directly from the actual aviators. In terms of, none of them were alive to interview, but their descendants were. So we got some sons and daughters of the Yale Unit aviators who had been told stories from their relatives.
When I watched the film, that was so neat to see actual descendants and family members reading these letters that their grandparents or great grandparents had handwritten and sent back from the war. But to hear it read with the emotion of a family member really added so much to the film. And also, you guys hired some pretty good voice talent to read the parts that weren't read by family members. And one of those guys is not a small time actor. We're talking about the film being narrated by Bruce Dern. He apparently is a descendant of one of the gentlemen that was in the Yale unit, and his voice, just that sound that he has to narrate this old timey stuff was incredible. Perfect voice for the job, and he's a very big actor. How did you get him to narrate the film?
I'll let Darroch talk about that a little bit.
Oh, okay. I'm very glad to hear you say that, Brandon. He was very fun to work with. He's a really fascinating guy, and a friend of ours, an older friend of Ron's, Fred Roos, who's the Francis Ford Coppola's producer and has produced a lot of big films um, out of Los Angeles. We were having a showing about a half hour, no, it was more than that, I don't know, 45-minute rough cut of the film, and invited Fred, and he said, oh, I'm going to bring Bruce Dern. He's related to Kenny McLeish, and we don't know how he knew that, except they're old friends, and I think Bruce's middle name is McLeish. But anyway, he was related to this very wealthy family from the North Shore of Chicago, and he was ostracized by his family for being an actor. Didn't talk to them for years, except for the poet Archibald McLeish, which was Kenny's older brother. But while we were recording the narration, on Bruce's phone, he brought up a photograph of the house he grew up in. And it was this four-turreted big mansion. And one of those turrets was his bedroom. And it was also Kenny McLeish's bedroom. It was the same room that the two had grown up in together. So it was very fun to have that connection. You know, we were looking for a long time to find somebody who was both a good narrator and would have some sort of connection to the story or to the film, so that when you would look at the package in the credit, you would think, oh, well, that makes sense. Not that anyone knows Bruce is related, but I'm glad you think you did a good job.
Yeah, no, it sounded great. And yeah, I mean, Bruce, of course, he has such a unique voice that to have his talent narrate your film is incredible. Now, while we're talking about that, what I want people to understand here is that, as we talked about before, these were privileged men. I mean, these guys were not just any run of the mill enlistees. I mean, these gentlemen were going to Yale, and their fathers were men of power. And like you said, growing up in a four-turreted mansion, I mean, these guys didn't have to go to war, but they decided that it was, like I said in the film, was it for God, for country, and for Yale, and their sense of duty to do this was actually pretty incredible for somebody who didn't have to do that. And one of the things that struck me was the families of these men. They'd write these letters like, "Dearest mother, here's what happened today," or "So and so went down in the North Sea," and yet the families, they seemed very proud that their children had or their sons, I'm sorry, had chosen to do this when they didn't have to do this at all. I mean, they were the richest men in the country. No one, they could have stayed home and just done whatever they want, but they chose to go to war. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like, or what your research turned up about why these guys chose to take this on?
Yeah, I think most of them felt a real responsibility to do something important with their lives, that they had these resources um, and money in which to do that. But I think we really have to take into account the excitement about aviation. The American frontier had been closed in 1896. We now stretch from coast to coast. Admiral Byrd had been up to the North Pole. People had sailed all around the world, but all of a sudden, here was this new technology for exploration and discovery, and opening up a whole new dimension in which to see the world. And that was very exciting. And you needed money to be an aviator, so I think there was a natural inclination for them to be drawn to that. And also, I don't think they really knew the extent of the war that they were getting into. And granted, they got there very late. and missed a lot of the real horror that was World War I. But there really was not much news getting over. Journalists were not allowed up at the front, so they didn't really know the conditions of the soldiers. I doubt too many people knew the high mortality rate. But there were all these glowing news reports, mostly regarding the Lafayette Escadrille, which were a group of Americans who went to France immediately and joined the Foreign Legion, and within a year had formed an all-American flying squadron under French command, flying for France. And these guys were also wealthy. They were Harvard and Yale graduates. And so there were all these news reports about these dashing Americans and what they were doing over there. And one of them, William Thaw, a Yale grad, or Yale, he left after his sophomore year, came back and spoke to Yale and spoke to the students and met the guys who were eventually in the First Yale Unit. And so they were very much inspired by his dashing bravado and the stuff they were doing over there. And so I think those were all the aspects of why it would have been exciting. You know, they all spoke about it as being the biggest event in history. They already knew how large the war was, and they would say, "I want to take part, however small, in this huge catastrophic event."
Yeah, I was going to add that at that time there was in the nation this notion of what they called a preparedness movement, which meant that there was a section of the populace which felt that the United States may indeed get involved in World War I, and that the nation should get prepared for that, even though the United States' official policy at that time was neutral in the war. And so at college campuses across the United States, not just Yale, but others as well, had a strong participation in the preparedness movement. And the Yale unit guys were well aware of this, and they wanted to get prepared as well. They were basically ahead of the Navy itself when in putting together this aviation unit, because Truby Davison, who was the leader of the Yale unit, felt that there was a good possibility that the U.S. would get involved. So he was kind of preparing in advance, and that notion spread through the other Yale unit members. I recall one letter of my grandfather's where, when the border incursion that Darroch was talking about was happening, my grandfather was like, "I better get down there and help those guys." And my grandfather's father, my great grandfather, said, "Hold on, you're not going anywhere." Sent him a telegram back and said, "No, you're not going over there." And so then, I don't know how many, 6 months later, when Davison was organizing the Yale unit at his estate on Long Island, and my grandfather got the telegram, he basically said, "Okay, well, let's go. We'll go over to Truby's house and learn how to fly." And let's see, my grandfather said something about, if we're going to be flying over water, so if we fall, we'll fall into water, so we probably won't get hurt. And that was a little naive, but there was a big feeling of wanting to contribute to getting ready for World War I, even before it started.
I should add that naval aviation was the very first American force over in Europe for World War I. They were on the ground first. They sent over a bunch of new guys who were learning to fly, but they hadn't flown yet, and they got there, I think, in July of 1917. But then quickly after that, Robert Lovett and Di Gates got over there, and Robert Lovett was the first American aviator to get up in the air, and I think the first one to fly in combat. And this is just because Truby Davison initiated these guys learning to fly, and they really had a jump of only a couple months. That they all got their Navy wings and joined in, because right behind them there was a second Yale unit, a third Yale unit, Princeton, MIT, Harvard, they all had aero clubs, and these guys were starting to learn to fly as well. But but the fact that the First Yale Unit was the first one over there, they became, in essence, the founding squadron of the Naval Air Reserve. These were not Navy officers. And the stipulation was you had to be an officer. You had to go through Annapolis and 4 years of sea duty before you could be an officer and then start learning to fly. But they needed these guys right away. So they hired them as civilians and put them into combat situations. We interviewed the former Secretary of the Navy under Reagan, John, Ron, I'm forgetting his name, John Lehman.
Yes.
And John said that when the Second World War came along, the ratio, and correct me on the number, Ron, was the ratio of actual Navy pilots to reserve pilots was 1 in 70. That was 70 parts reserve pilots compared to only 1 that were trained Navy officers.
That's correct.
Wow. So it sounds like, I mean, this happens often now too, I'd say, but private industry was more ready, more prepared, and had the technology to just go for it more so than the War Department did at that time.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Navy had something like 54 airplanes at the beginning of World War I. So, and most of them didn't work very well.
Yeah, those 54 planes were all considered obsolete at the start of the war. Brandon, depending on what you want to talk about, I thought we should start talking about airplanes because we mentioned that they learned to fly on this flying boat. And we did not realize it at the time. We're actually working on another World War I aviation film right now. But we hit this window of time over the 7 years that it took us to make the film, in which we got opportunities to shoot planes that I just don't know are going to come around again. And one of them was with the Glenn Hammond Curtis Museum up in Hammondsport, New York on Lake Keuka. And they have a restoration shop there. And we had gone up there and filmed their A1 Triad one summer. And then they told us the next summer coming up, they were going to fly the Model E flying boat, this replica 1913 Model E. And Ron, I thought, oh boy, we'll probably be done with the film by then, which was not even close to being true. And Ron and I returned the next summer. And in this one window, one day they had some test flights with it. And then 2 days later, they flew it for the public. And that's the only time that plane is ever going to fly. And as far as we could tell, that is the only workable flying boat in the world. And so Ron and I were able to film it. And you can see in the film that when they're learning how to fly, we use this footage, filming on Lake Keuka, doubling for the Long Island Sound. And we got a very rare, interesting boat from the air.
That's amazing. Now, you guys also did some filming down in New Zealand. Is that correct?
Yes. Peter Jackson has been a World War I aviation aficionado for years, and he has built this incredible collection of, several dozen planes, some with original engines. And we went down there because we really wanted a Sopwith Camel with an original engine. We had heard this one up in Central California. The owner of it, Javier Arango, did not want to get up in the air with a helicopter. He just said, my collection's not built for that, and we understood. There was one in England, but it was mothballed and was going to be expensive to get up and running. And then there was New Zealand, but the photographs we had seen, New Zealand looked like California. They were shooting in the New Zealand summer, which is our winter. But we finally realized that that's really where we had to go. We called them up. We said, this is what we want to do. This is about how much money we have. And they said, come on out. And we got there in their fall, and it had rained and everything was green. And so that's really the majority of where we did our photography. And we rented a helicopter. Ron and I had never done this before. And there was a guy down there who had just designed and built this camera gimbal that could turn 360 degrees. And everyone pitched in and gave us discounts for everything because we were making a World War I aviation documentary, but also to work with Peter Jackson's beautiful collection. And We could only afford to rent the helicopter for 3 hours, but we rented their Cessna for 3 days, and over a 5 day period, we really got some outstanding footage, and we were able to illustrate all of the different sequences throughout the film that we had wanted to shoot, and that's where we got most of our photography.
Yeah, those parts you can sort of tell what was filmed in New Zealand because it's such a beautiful country, and those aerial shots were amazing.
Yeah, we really.
I wanted to just say that in terms of the photography, as Darroch mentioned, we use a helicopter, we use a Cessna with a stabilized camera, but we also took GoPro cameras and put them all over the airplane. So we would have them on the pilot's chest. We would put them on the guns looking out. That point of view. We put some cameras on the tails of airplanes. And the whole point of that was to try as best we could, and we did that the same thing with the flight with the flying boat, is we wanted to get our audience to try to feel what it was like to be in the pilot's seat. And, as you know, Darroch and I neither one of us are pilots, but the pilots we were working with were willing to, wear these cameras either on their helmets or on their chest to get shots from the pilot's point of view. And I think it goes a long way to helping our audience feel like, wow, this is what it was like. And of course, the thing that people sometimes forget is these are all open cockpit airplanes. so they would go in the war, they would go up to, multiple thousand feet high, where it was absolutely freezing up there. And they would, wear these huge insulated suits, but it would be freezing. And there's a moment in the film where Kenny McLeish comes back down. He says, I'll tell you more after I've thawed out.
Ron,
I can only imagine. One of my favorite shots in the film was, I forget which of the gentlemen it was, but one of the other men had just been shot down, and he was mad, and he went out, and I think he took out 2 or 3 people at once, came back, thawed out, fueled up, and he was going back for more vengeance. And I believe it was one of the Sopwith scenes, but it was probably one of those GoPro ones that you were talking about, where you could see the pilot's hand on the control stick and the left hand on the throttle. But it's not like you'd expect, where the control stick just comes straight up. I mean, it does come up from the middle, but it was almost like a handle, and then the throttle was over on the side. And just watching him control the aircraft, his control technique was almost sort of frantic to keep the airplane flying properly. And it's not like today, where everything is very smooth and refined, and you just give small inputs to keep the aircraft working within its own stability. But these guys were constantly having to control these wood and fabric planes that were not inherently very stable and that were made for dogfighting. And just watching the guy's hand technique, just doing simple maneuvers, it was downright frantic to see. It was incredible.
I'm so glad you like that, Brandon, because Ron and I don't know whose idea it was to put the GoPro camera on Gene DeMarco's chest. But I don't know if you notice, his face is actually reflected in one of the instrument dials, as you can see him. With the stick flying the plane. And again, the little 15-minute film we have on the Blu-ray DVD about flying the Sopwith Camel talks very specifically about why it was such a unique plane. And it's because the weight, which was all together, the gas tank, the engine, the pilot, was a little bit far back from where the wings were. And so Javier explains the plane is always hunting for its speed, and you have to be flying that plane constantly. There's no autopilot, of course, but it won't just glide on its own. You have to be on it every second, and then also you have to be firing your gun, mixing your fuel, making sure that the oil is still coming out of the engine, and that you're not burning it up. It was a very complex and yet sophisticated and yet effective airplane.
I could only imagine what it would be like to do that at the time. And I wonder if maybe that's some of that adventure that these frankly, rich kids thought that they were going after was those experiences, and they're going to go out and fly these airplanes that they've only heard of, like a Stop with Camel. And one of the other funny parts was they're going to go over there and get a Parisian education while they're at it, and we can talk about that in a minute. But I feel like that was probably a lot of the motivation that these kids felt, that plus a sense of duty that got them over there. But then, of course, when they got there, they realized the realities of war. And, before we move on here, there was a quote from one of the letters from one of the men, John Voorhees. And this was very early on when they were training in the Marianne. And I want to read it real quick because I thought it illustrated the attitude that these guys had, sort of with what they were up against, or what they thought they were up against. But John Voorhees, he was aviator number 73, I guess. And Ron, am I correct that he's your grandfather?
That is correct.
Okay, so is it okay if I read this for you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this letter, it says, "Dear Mother, I've just taken my first lesson. I was in the air 33 minutes and made every mistake aviators have made in 10 years. And quick side note, that was the history of aviation at the time. And back to the letter, theoretically breaking my neck 1,072 times. I handled the rudder fairly well, but keeping level with the ailerons were absolutely beyond me. And if I'd gone where I aimed with the elevator, I'd have looped the loop. When you're learning, you haven't time to think of danger or anything but what a boob you are. It's fascinating, though, and I wouldn't think to stop. Love to Pop." And just knowing that danger of just learning to train and trying to get through this was there, but I wouldn't think to stop. This is just too much fun. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great letter, and it's true that they were just enthralled with the experience of flying. I remember in one of the letters, my grandfather talking about looking down and seeing, tiny towns, as he said. And I think just the notion of being up in the air and being able to explore the world from that perspective was really exciting to them.
Ron's grandfather was a really good letter writer, and he had a great sense of humor. We refer to him as the Samuel Pepys of the unit. And it's too bad that Mark Wertman didn't have access to his letters. And I think Ron is looking into getting them published because not only is he a good writer, but he did those drawings and sketches that you see in the film. And a lot of his letters are illustrated, which is doubly fun. But the points you bring up, Brandon, about this might have been exciting. For some of them, it really was, and for Dave Ingalls, who excelled and was the Navy's only ace in World War I. I mean, he really took to flying, as did Kenny McLeish, like a fish to water. But a good number of the other guys did not have it in them. But they wanted to support their friends. They believed in the cause that they were doing, and a couple of them really got in over their heads and died because of it, just because they really didn't have the aptitude to fly. And yet, it's rather sad. There's one character in the film that he says, I really can't do this. But the thought of backing out of what he thought would have been letting his friends down, when he really should not have been in the cockpit of an airplane. He just, as one other character said, he never got the hang of it, and he paid with his life.
All right, gentlemen. So let's talk about Truby Davison. He was the founder of this whole thing, and for me, he was the character that really sucked me into the film. And the funny reason behind that is because when I look at my own 3-year-old, and then I look at these pictures of Truby, and as I was watching the film, I screenshotted a couple things and sent pictures to my wife, like, "Hey, does this remind you of him?" And my wife was like, "Yeah, a little bit. Who is this guy?" And so as I told her about that, he was the founder of this whole Yale Unit thing. The way that I project that my 3-year-old will be as an adult, that look that Truby had in these pictures, just that look in his eye, the look on his face, that he was cooking something up, and it was brilliant. It just made me feel somehow personally connected to this. So can you guys just expand on who Truby Davison was and what he did and how he started this whole incredible thing?
You have a real bond with Truby, Ron. Why don't you talk about him?
I mean, the thing about Truby is that he was a visionary, and he was very, very motivated. So once he got the idea after his experience volunteering on the front, he actually went over as an ambulance driver before the Yale unit got started. And he actually was able to see what happened to some of the soldiers with their experience in the trench warfare and the results of that. And he actually wanted to take his volunteer ambulance unit and get them into the kind of the one of the more devastated areas of the trench warfare. And there were some people above him that said, no, it's probably better if you don't go into that that particular area. But he did service the soldiers at the front and realized during that that he'd like to get into the aviation aspect of it. So when he got back to the United States, he petitioned his mother and his father to get this aviation unit started. And his mom was in favor of it. She thought that it would probably be a pretty good idea. Partly that was because Truby eventually got her to take an airplane ride, and she said, "Oh, this is wonderful. Let's support the boys." But the father, H.P. Davison, who happened to be J.P. Morgan's business partner, when he found out about Truby's plans, he was on a fishing trip up in Labrador, and he sent word back to the Davison family estate back on Long Island. He said, "Nope, don't do anything." And so then when Mr. Davison Sr. got back to Long Island, Truby had this whole scheme where he had Dave McCullough fly the Marianne in and land on the sound near the Davison estate to kind of show off the airplane. And still the father was like, "Oh, okay, I see what you're trying to do. You're trying to persuade me by showing these cool airplanes." But it took a little bit more than that for Mr. Davison to be persuaded to support the unit. So the thing about it that I love about Truby is he just did not take no for an answer. He he kept maneuvering to get people on board with his idea, and eventually his parents signed off on it. And then it was a matter of getting his friends involved. And so he sent a telegram to his best friends at Yale saying, "Hey, I'm going to put this unit together. You guys want to come and join and learn how to fly?" And that's when they had to get then permission from their parents to become involved. And I should say that Bob Lovett came on board very early with Truby, and the two of them ended up doing a lot of research and planning about how to really start the unit. So in effect, it was really Truby and Bob who kind of really motivated the whole project from the beginning. But I do think that it was Truby's character that inspired his friends to want to get involved and to get the unit going. So in that regard, yeah, Truby was really the impetus to get it all started.
He was a real doer, and apparently quite charismatic. And his friends all spoke about how much his leadership meant, but how he really led by example. It's kind of interesting that he's not a very good letter writer. He's probably the weakest of the letter writers there. But because of his injury and because of who he represented for everybody else through the war effort, they all wrote to him. And so there's a collection, the Truby Davison papers at the Sterling Library at Yale, that have all the letters from all the pilots and all the different things they're doing. So when something big happens, when one of the pilots dies, when one of the big squadrons is getting ready for a campaign, you can check the date and then look at everybody's correspondence. And we built the script that way of everyone giving their point of view of how they felt about each one of these incidents. And so Truby was doubly effective, both as a character and for his collection of everyone else's letters.
Though the letters that the men were writing back to Truby was one of my favorite parts of the film, because they felt, you could tell that they felt that even though he wasn't there with them, that he was still sort of their spiritual leader. He was the founder of this whole thing. And so all the top men, because a lot of these guys attained very high ranks and were very influential in the war, and then particularly after the war was over in their political careers that followed. But they always wrote back to Truby. They always reported back as if they were still reporting to some sort of superior, with these incredibly well-written letters that were just detailing who did what, who had passed, who was missing, their accomplishments. And it was just amazing to see the even though they were at war and they'd been there for a long time, they were still writing home to Truby because he was the guy who started the whole thing. And would it be okay with you guys, for people who have not seen the film yet, of course, to talk about why Truby was not there with them?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll talk about it a little bit, and then maybe Darroch can also talk about it. So one of the things that happened with the Yale unit was, once they had appealed to the Navy to take their unit on, and the Navy's first response was, well, love what you guys are doing, but we don't need you. Again, Truby was being told, we don't need you by the government. And Truby basically said, well, we'll see about that. And so he kept the unit going. He didn't shut it down at that point. And eventually the Navy said, actually, we do need you. and so they ended up joining the Navy as a ready-made unit. And of course, they didn't have, they had to go through some tests in order to get their Navy wings. As Darroch said, they didn't go through the traditional military channels to get into the Navy as aviators. So they had a test for their Navy wings, which involved flying up to a certain elevation and then coming down, and they had to land at a particular marker on the water, a buoy, and then I'll let Darroch pick up the story from there.
Oh, I've got to do the dramatic part. We talk in the film about what it took to fly a plane, and mostly we hear from one of Truby's grandsons, Mike Davison, who's the grandson of both Truby and Dave Ingalls. And he's a pilot, and he talks about the danger of stalling, and that these were very heavy planes. They were all made of solid wood, heavy engine, and the aerodynamics were still pretty new. This is a 1913 plane. So Truby is coming in and spiraling down to fly to land at this buoy and do a very nice landing to show that he can land accurately. And apparently he started to land too soon. And he didn't think he was close enough to the buoy, and he lifted the nose of the plane and he stalled and fell into the water. And you can see in the film the way the engine, this is a pusher airplane, so the propeller is behind the pilot and the engine is right behind him and above him, sitting on what looks like a sawhorse. And so the impact of the plane hitting the water broke the engine mount, and the engine hit him in the back. And he started to sink in the plane, and he's tangled in the cockpit, and the wires of the broken wings are all around him. And he said, I remember so well going down into the water and looking up and seeing the surface above me and struggling to get out. And his back was broken. And I don't know if he came over on a launch, but it was Dave McCullough who dove in and pulled Truby out of the wreckage. Meanwhile, Dave Ingalls and I think Robert Lovett and maybe Kurt Reed got in a sports car and headed into Manhattan to warn them that an injured pilot was coming into the emergency room. And I think they took Truby by boat, and he was laid up in the hospital for a year. He wasn't quite paraplegic. He lived another, I think, 60 years. He could actually play tennis standing in one spot in the middle of the court. But like FDR, he had leg braces and walked with a cane. He was a skipper. He loved to sail. And he actually did some flying. He was the Undersecretary of Air, I think the very first one after the war. He said his most important contribution was getting rid of all the World War I planes so that they could start building anew, which they didn't really do. Well, no, that's not true. They did. But he was director of the Museum of Natural History in New York. After that, he was the first personnel director for the CIA, which again was pretty much picked from Yale graduates. And apparently was really, really loved by everybody. Lovely guy.
Yeah, no, the irony just in this story that this man who was one of the biggest go-getters there was, that had started this Yale unit from nothing, and even when he was told no by the government, that he still kept going, was injured to the point that he could no longer fly or command this unit on the final test that would make him a naval aviator. The irony behind that is just mind-blowing to me. And that was one of my favorite parts of the film, was just that part of the story and how crazy that was for him.
And he was the only pilot that didn't get his wings. Everybody else passed that day, and I think into the next one. They all saw his accident, and he was the very first guy up. And Robert Lovett came next, Di Gates, and they all went up. And as one of our interviewees says, did what they had to do, came down, landed, and got their wings. But 50 years later, in 1966, at Peacock Point, the Davison estate where Truby then lived, the Navy gave him his Navy wings, and it was filmed for a television show in New York. I can't remember the name of the show. Maybe Ron does, but there's color photography of these guys, in their 70s, and we get to see Robert Lovett and Dave Ingalls and John Voorhees and Earl Gould and Truby Davison as old men, still hanging out together.
Yeah, the name of that program is called 50 Years After, and it was done by CBS, I believe.
Yeah, Eyes of New York or something. I can't remember the series name.
Eyes on New York. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the series.
So now might be a good time to talk about, or sort of recap, the accomplishments of these guys that were in the First Yale Unit. There was one Medal of Honor nominee. There were 2 recipients of the Distinguished Flying Cross. There were 3 recipients of the Distinguished Service Medal and 11 recipients of the Navy Cross. And so many of these men, particularly the ones that you just mentioned, had gone on to have very successful business and political careers afterward.
Yeah, my favorite character is Robert Lovett, and a really smart, capable guy who might not seem so interesting, except that he writes these extraordinary love letters to his girlfriend and then his fiancée. And he was a very analytical guy. His father had trained him to be so, and really looked at what naval aviation could do and why it wasn't working very well. And it really took a survey of all of the bases and worked with the British Navy commanders and really recommended how he thought the war should be fought and ended. And 20 years later, took that same experience into World War II. So he came up with the concept, well, the British did, but he built upon it, the concept of strategic bombing and how important that was, and to keep it going and use different planes and fly bombing missions day and night and really break down the enemy that way. And in 1938 or 39, he was in a restaurant in Milan, Italy, and overheard these German officers talking about how strong the German Air Force was. And he came home, and he was president of Brown Brothers Bank. He was president of the Union Pacific Railroad. And it was time for him to do his annual survey of all of the factories, stations, yards of the Union Pacific. And as he did that, he also checked out all of the aviation areas, factories, and airports around the nation, and realized that we were woefully unprepared for the war that was going to come. He wrote another one of his succinct and in-depth memos to General. To Henry Stimson, the Secretary of State for Roosevelt, and I think to George Marshall, and said, we're not prepared at all, and we have to start preparing for, again, had the jump on it, have to start preparing for this war that we know is going to come. And so he was Undersecretary of Air during the Second World War. Then Truman brought him into his administration, and he was acting Secretary of State during the Berlin airlift, and then the Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. And then Kennedy asked him to come on to his cabinet, and he said, no, my bearings are burned out. I can't do it. But through Lovett and also through Di Gates, I mean, he was also, I think, Assistant Secretary of Air for the Navy in World War II. I mean, these guys really influenced combat aviation and military preparedness, on into the Cold War. So for most of the 20th century, it's pretty extraordinary.
It truly is. And you know what? I realize we probably shouldn't give any more of the movie away. People need to just go see it themselves, but I could talk about this thing all day long. So before we go, what's the significance of the film's release date?
So the significance of the film's release date is that it is on February 15th, which is the 100th anniversary of the passing of one of the Yale Unit members, Albert D. Sturtevant, who was the first U.S. Naval Aviator killed in combat. And the story behind that, beyond the recognition that we have as filmmakers and citizens of his service to the country, is that my grandfather, John Voorhees, was in service with him at the time, and there was a situation where Albert Sturtevant had not been flying for a few days due to the weather. It might have been longer than that, might have been a couple of weeks. And he asked my grandfather if it would be possible to change places with him on a scheduled patrol. And my grandfather said, well, I don't know, let's check with the CO on that. And so they went to the commanding officer, and the officer allowed them to switch places. So Sturtevant took my grandfather's position as second pilot on one of the patrols over the North Sea. And they went out and were attacked by a squadron of German seaplanes. And unfortunately, Al's plane was shot down. And he was the second pilot, meaning that he would take over if the first pilot was injured. But his situation in an attack was that he had to go into the forward position on the machine gun, which is completely exposed. And there's a drawing that my grandfather did of Sturtevant in this position. And he had to defend the flying boat from these German fighter planes. But unfortunately, the plane did go down, and it crashed into the North Sea. The Germans actually came back, and they at one point saw some of the pilots or aviators clinging to the wreckage. But then when the seas were too high for them to land and rescue anyone, because back in those days they actually would potentially rescue the enemy in a situation like that. And when they came back, the plane was gone, and so was Al. So it was a very unfortunate ending to Al, and my grandfather certainly wrote about it in his letters, and we learned from my uncle in an interview that's not in the film that this whole incident stayed with my grandfather his entire life, as you can well imagine. So the date is really to honor Al's service and his passing. as the first U.S. Naval Aviator killed in combat.
Any of your audience is in Los Angeles, we're having our Los Angeles premiere on February 17th, Saturday night, at the Museum of Flying at the Santa Monica Airport. And reception starts at 7 with the film at 8, and we would be more than happy to see anybody there.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I will do my best to get there.
Oh, thank you, Brandon.
So the premiere's on the 17th there. And where can people go after that to see or purchase the film?
Millionairesunit.org will lead you to a sales site. You could get it at Amazon. If you have a Blu-ray player, I recommend getting a Blu-ray because the footage, particularly the flying footage, just looks exceptional. But again, there are 4 supplementary films. There's a half-hour film on the birth of naval aviation, about how aviation started with the Navy and pretty much ending around the time the First Yale Unit came in. There's a 20-minute film on the largest naval air base at Hull, England, called Killing Home, and it's about the spiderweb patrols that they did to hunt for submarines, and a couple of the Yale unit guys were in that. And as I mentioned, the 15-minute film about flying the Sopwith Camel. And then we have a half-hour film about the making of that shows Ron's and my hairline receding and getting grayer over the 7 years it took to pull all this together.
And I should say that in addition to the Blu-ray and DVD that are currently available on Amazon, we will be releasing the film on video on demand on several platforms, including Amazon, and also on Vimeo and Vudu and a few others. That is all beginning. The rollout on that is going to start on the 15th. We'll definitely be available on Vimeo on the 15th, and we may be available on Amazon on that day. But look for us over the next few months to be available on many of the VOD platforms.
And again, our website address is millionairesunit.org.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. It's an incredible film. I encourage everybody to go see it. It's fantastic. And thank you, gentlemen, so much for being here and sharing.
Oh, Brandon, thanks for your interest. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.